Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Today talking about top camera settings for successful shooting. But first, I want to talk a little bit about me. Introduce myself. I'm Tim Grey, of course. I'm sure most of you already knew that. Maybe that's part of the reason that you're here. And today we're going to be talking about top camera settings. This actually is a photo of me exploring a beach in southern Australia. And along this trip, I was thinking more and more about photographers, about our upcoming photo workshops, and about the different settings, the things that photographers tend to struggle with just a little bit in the context of their photography. And so I think it's important to think about these things from time to time in terms of various camera settings. First off, though, before we dive in, I do want to thank Tamron for sponsoring this webinar series, this presentation series. Without their support, this would be a lot more challenging to put together. So thank you to Tamron. And by the way, check out, if you haven't already, the video series from Tamron, One Location, One Lesson, One Lens. There's an episode of that series that features me out in the Palouse, and you can check that out at youtube.com/TamronVids. So be sure to check that out. But let's go ahead and dive right into top camera settings for successful shooting. And again, some of these settings are probably going to be a bit of a repeat for many of you. And so I'm sure some of this is not exactly new. Some of this, I'm sure, is not mysterious. But I find that in many cases, there are situations where photographers kind of forget about certain settings, certain options that are available. Maybe they forget that the setting is even there, or they forget how to use it, or they're just not thinking about all of the various options that are available. And so some of this certainly will be repeat. Some of this, I'm sure, not new to many of you, but I think worthwhile to review in any event. I should also point out that, of course, the settings I'm going to be talking about, I'll be talking about them a little bit in the context of my own workflow. Obviously, every camera is different. Some of the features I talk about you might not have available. Maybe some of them you'll want, and so you'll go out and buy a brand new camera so that you can get access to additional features. And obviously, the implementation will vary from one camera to the next. So I'm not going to talk too much about the specifics of how you use all of these features necessarily. You might need to check your manual. Yes, there is a user manual for your camera that can help you get all of the particular details. But one of the first things I want to mention, really I think mostly just a matter of a reminder, is that your camera has essentially software built into it. And when we're talking about a piece of equipment, a piece of hardware, the software that we put into this type of a device, so like a camera, is referred to as firmware. And that is essentially the operating system for your camera. And so you'll find from time to time that there are updates, and just like software on your computer, those updates may include bug fixes. They might also include new features. I know it might seem a little bit of a surprise, but there are indeed periodically new features that are made available on the camera by virtue of a firmware update. So I would encourage you periodically to check the camera manufacturer's website, generally in their support section, and see if there is a firmware update that might help improve your overall camera, the workflow for your camera, fix some issues with your camera, etc. In addition, now here's a common one that, if I'm being honest, I have neglected or forgotten on more than one occasion, and that is to set the time zone for your camera. When you change time zone locations, change the camera setting for the time zone, make sure that you're essentially set to local time. I know some photographers prefer to always have their camera set to Greenwich Mean Time, and I certainly understand that, but to me it's useful to have the actual time that the photo was taken be part of the metadata, and hopefully an accurate date and time. I don't tend to remember the dates all that well. I half the time don't even know what day of the week it is. But I do find that sometimes I like to filter my photos based on the date of capture, and sometimes a photo might have been captured because of the date, because it was a special event or what have you. In addition, the time can be helpful. When I'm looking for photos that were captured around sunset, or I'm looking for night photos, those sorts of things, that information can be helpful. So I do encourage making sure, and especially if you have multiple cameras, making sure that they're all set to about the same time. Synchronize those clocks so that if you're sorting photos by capture time, you've got an accurate sort order. Another interesting setting I find I didn't used to pay attention to when I was younger. In fact, when I was just getting started in photography, I had no idea that this setting existed. It wasn't until I got to a certain age that I learned about this diopter adjustment when I started wearing glasses, and as I started needing more glasses more of the time and finding that it became a little bit more of a challenge. And there's a couple of approaches you could take. The diopter essentially is a focus setting for the viewfinder. So what you see through the viewfinder, your focus points and your camera settings, exposure settings, etc. And so you can literally adjust the focus using that diopter control so that when you look through the viewfinder, the controls there, the displays within the viewfinder, are nice and sharp. Now, of course, that begs the question of what are we adjusting the diopter based on? Should you take off your glasses and adjust based on your less than perfect vision? Or do you keep your glasses on and adjust based on your vision through your glasses? And obviously the question there then is, do you prefer to wear your glasses when you're doing your photography, when you're looking through the viewfinder, or do you prefer them off? And the diopter adjustment generally, as long as your vision is not too far off, there's a limited range, of course, but this can help make sure that you're getting a good experience working with your camera, looking through the viewfinder. Moving on to actual settings related to our photography, a super obvious one that I'm sure all of you are well aware of and are following is to take advantage of RAW capture. I hope this has become sort of almost a non-issue. Everybody knows that we should be shooting in RAW. And by RAW, I don't mean RAW plus JPEG. Admittedly, with certain workflows, RAW plus JPEG can work. So, as with everything that I suggest, you might have a different opinion and there might be a better approach that works for your specific needs. So certain workflows certainly can benefit from RAW plus JPEG, but many photographers are, of course, using a product such as Lightroom where previews are being built based on the RAW captures, and so there's actually no point in having those JPEG captures in the first place. To me, the most important benefit of RAW capture is that you're avoiding JPEG artifacts. So JPEG captures are by their nature lossy, meaning that you are losing a certain amount of information because it is compressing that information, essentially trying to simplify the overall contents of the photo itself. And so those artifacts are very difficult to get rid of, virtually impossible to get rid of, and they can be problematic, especially if you're going to enlarge the image. So that's the most important thing in my mind when it comes to choosing RAW rather than JPEG. But RAW capture also gives you greater bit depth. With most cameras, that's probably going to be 14-bit per channel information out of the camera. Some are still 12-bit, some have 16-bit. But if it's JPEG, it's only 8-bit. And RAW just gives you more flexibility. Yes, it's going to give you a little bit more work to do in post-processing of working with those RAW captures potentially, depending on the software you're using. But I think that's well worth it. And then, of course, after we've set our cameras to RAW, we need to think about the exposure mode. And I mean that quite literally. Because when it comes to choosing an exposure mode, I know many photographers like to suggest that real photographers shoot in manual mode. That you manually adjust your settings for the exposure and you evaluate the meter, or maybe you ignore the meter because you're such an amazing photographer that you know what those exposure settings need to be just by intuition. But for most of us, of course, you want a little bit of help from the camera, and why not take advantage of the great technology built into that camera to streamline the process of getting a great exposure? For me personally, I find that aperture priority mode is the best option for setting my exposure. Number one, that's prioritizing the aperture or depth of field, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. And then I can use exposure compensation to deal with the fact that the camera is going to be tricked, essentially. So with this photo, for example, very bright day, the light is rather strong, but there's a fair amount of relatively dark areas, kind of mid-tone and darker. And so most of the image is not super bright, but some of those souvenirs in the basket, especially over toward the right-hand side, are quite bright. They're white and they're getting full sunlight. And so those areas, the camera is sort of going to ignore. And so the meter is not going to reflect that information, those bright white areas, and as a result is possibly going to essentially suggest exposure settings that will cause those small areas of highlight to be blown out. And that's what we're trying to avoid, is blown out highlights. So to me, it's all about how do you think about exposure? How do you think about getting to the right exposure? Or more to the point, how do you think about the notion of the camera's meter, the light meter in the camera, getting fooled? And for me, what makes the most sense is that I'm trusting the baseline calculations of the camera, but then applying my own knowledge of how the camera's meter might be fooled. So in a situation like this, I'm thinking I probably need to set a -1/2 stop exposure compensation. Now, you could accomplish the exact same thing by using manual and adjusting the shutter speed and the aperture, but then compensating. So enabling the meter to read a little too dark or a little too bright, depending on what the circumstance is. So to me, it's all about how are you thinking about this? Are you wanting to adjust two settings, the shutter speed and the aperture, as you follow the meter around, or do you just want to apply compensation and use aperture priority mode? I generally don't recommend shutter priority mode, in large part because we have a narrower range of apertures available compared to shutter speeds, and so there's a risk of potentially running out of aperture. In other words, that you cannot get a good exposure at a given shutter speed that you've established. So obviously you can just monitor that and adjust accordingly, but to me that's just one more potential challenge that you might need to face. And generally speaking, the more automatic modes, so auto mode or program mode, I generally don't like because they don't give you as much creative control as you can get with these other modes. That said, if you're uncomfortable with exposure, if you don't feel confident yet in your ability to get good exposures, to get good camera settings, I certainly think it's worthwhile to start there. Set your camera to program mode. It becomes a little bit more of a point-and-shoot camera, but now you're maybe going to be better able to get the shot rather than miss the shot, and then over time, you develop your skills where you're able to take more creative control over your photos. And then related to that exposure mode, of course, is the metering mode, because we're choosing an exposure mode based on the way we sort of want to think about compensating for exposure issues for metering. And that comes back to how the camera is reading the scene. And you'll have several types of metering options. So, for example, evaluative or a matrix metering, which is taking into account the entire scene. There's center weighted, where whatever's in the middle of the frame is treated as being more important in terms of exposure. Spot metering, where a very small area of the scene at the center of the frame is being metered. And of course, part of this is understanding how the meter is going to be tricked by the light. So we all know that the meter is essentially trying to put the average light level in the scene at a middle gray value. So a scene like this that is essentially all bright, bright snow and clouds, overcast clouds, but still reflecting a fair amount of light. These are areas that should be relatively bright, but the meter is trying to make these essentially middle gray. And so we would need to compensate and brighten up by 1 to 2 stops, depending on the conditions, so that we're getting the white levels in this case that we actually want. And so how do you figure that out? Well, mostly it's about experience. It's about working with your camera enough that you get a sense of when it's fooled. If it's spot metering, then you need to choose what are you going to meter off of. So maybe you meter off the snow here and increase your exposure by 2 stops. Or if you're using matrix or evaluative, then it's going to evaluate more of the scene, and so you might only need to increase by perhaps 1 stop, again, depending on the particular circumstances. But a lot of that comes down to 2 things. Number 1, recognizing that the metering in the camera is not especially smart. It's getting better and better. It's actually using a variety of tools to try to figure out what kind of scene it is, depending on which camera you're using. But at the same time, the other issue is that it's going to be tricked. It's not necessarily going to be spot on, and you need to understand how the meter is going to be tricked and sort of by how much, being able to estimate. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to get it perfect. I've been taking pictures for a lot of years. I pay attention to the meter, to the overall situation, the lighting where I'm photographing. And generally, I can say, okay, here I need to go to an even exposure, or in this situation, I might need -1/2 stop or +1 stop, and I get it wrong periodically. But you'll get it wrong initially, and with practice, you start to learn when you are getting it wrong, and you sort of correct for that, and you'll get more and more accurate in terms of being able to establish the right settings for that overall exposure. Now, of course, the first part is getting a good exposure. Then we also want to make sure that creatively it is giving us the effect that we want, that the photograph is being interpreted in a way that we're most happy. And so a big part of that, perhaps the biggest factor in many cases, is depth of field in terms of how that scene is rendered. And so sometimes, for example, as with this photograph here, you might want lots and lots of depth of field. In fact, you might even go so far as to figure out the hyperfocal distance, which I actually did with this shot because I wanted to make sure that I really was going to be able to have everything in focus. And so with the lens that I was using, I used a calculator, depth of field calculator, in order to determine, number one, what is the nearest point that I could focus and still have focus all the way to infinity. And with that information, then I knew I was confident. I think in this case I was a few feet, maybe 3 to 5 feet away from the wheat in the foreground. And so knowing where I could set that distance and therefore set my focus so that I could have the entire scene in focus. So sometimes you want lots and lots of depth of field with a landscape typically, for example. In other situations, you might want narrow depth of field. In this case, I would say sort of extremely narrow depth of field. I don't even want the whole flower in focus. I want to sort of help emphasize the inner details of this flower and make the photo look, I think, a little bit more interesting by having very narrow depth of field so that we're really focused in, literally, I guess, no pun intended, but we're focused in on the central area of that flower. And to me, this type of narrow depth of field effect can really be very impactful. I like the effect quite a lot. And of course, in order to accomplish this, we need to be familiar with the various ranges of possibility in terms of depth of field. So I've had on some of my photo workshops, photographers will ask when we're up on top of Steptoe Butte in the Palouse, 1,000 feet above the landscape below, focusing on something that's like a half mile or more away from us, and asking what they should stop down their lens to. And in that type of scenario, focusing from such a distance, you're going to get a lot of depth of field regardless. Or with macro or close-up photography, I've stopped down to all the way down to f/22 and I'm still not getting the depth of field. Why? Because it's macro photography and you just can't get that much depth of field when you're focusing that close to a subject. You'd have to resort to things like focus stacking. And so having a sense of what are those really close distances where I know I'm going to struggle to get a lot of depth of field or enough depth of field? And what are those larger distances where it's going to be difficult to get narrow depth of field if I wanted it? And then the sweet spot in between, that range where we're able to exercise the most flexibility because we are able to choose between lots of depth of field or little depth of field. And so gaining a better understanding of that and then adjusting that aperture primarily. Obviously thinking about lens choice, thinking about, can I get closer to my subject to narrow the depth of field more and those sorts of things. But the key setting being, of course, the lens aperture. And then with a preview, if you can anticipate precisely how much depth of field you're going to get, that's wonderful. But if your camera has a depth of field preview feature, I strongly recommend making use of that because it will make it so much easier to get a sense of how much of the scene will be in focus. Now, the challenge of the depth of field preview is that when you push that button on your camera to stop down the lens aperture to whatever it is that you've set the camera to, now you're darkening the scene significantly, and so it can be very difficult to actually see what that depth of field looks like. It's now so dark that you can't tell what's in focus at all. And that's where the live view preview is just amazing. It's one of a couple. I'll talk about another issue here with live view in a moment, but being able to see the actual effect, so using the live view display on your camera, which some of you are using cameras where it's just always via live view, if you're using some mirrorless cameras, for example. and then using that depth of field preview feature so that the exposure preview that you're seeing in that live view display also reflects the actual depth of field that you're going to be getting in the final photo. It can be tremendously helpful, especially as you're just getting familiar with the issues that affect depth of field for your photos. Now that tends to be the most important setting, in my mind, creatively, under typical circumstances. So depth of field is one of those issues, one of those settings that we can adjust with our camera, and in terms of the exposure settings, that gives us creative control. It's one of two. Well, the other one would be shutter speed. And it's easy to fall into this trap of just always wanting a fast shutter speed. So first we need to think about, of course, if we're shooting handheld, what are the limits? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the kind of rule of thumb that your shutter speed should be the reciprocal of your focal length. So with a 500 millimeter lens, you need a 1/500th of a second shutter speed. And that's a pretty good general rule to help compensate for the fact that the camera is handheld and therefore there's a little bit of movement, and that movement essentially is magnified by a longer lens. So with a longer lens, you need a faster shutter speed. Of course, it also fails to take into account subject movement. And so sometimes, even with a moving subject, you might select a shutter speed that's too fast. So here, for example, a crop duster out in the Palouse region of eastern Washington, and with a fast shutter speed, that propeller is essentially frozen. And so it looks like this pilot is having a rough day. What I want to do in this case is use a shutter speed that's a little bit slower. I want to max out at about a 2/50th of a second or so in order to allow there to be a little bit of blur from motion of that prop. It also means that I'm going to struggle a little bit more to get sharp photos of the plane that's moving at 100 miles an hour across the landscape. And so there can be this little bit of a balancing act, but I want to make sure that I'm not using a shutter speed that's too fast. And we want to think about the nature of what we're photographing and try to be mindful of the fact that freezing motion is not always a good thing. Of course, then there's the other extreme where sometimes you might say, oh, well, I've got water and I want to blur that water, so let's get the slowest shutter speed I possibly can. And you go out and get a 30-second exposure of the water and you get this wonderful silky effect. But sometimes that's a little bit too much. In this case, I don't think that this interpretation of the photo was quite the right interpretation of the photo, because it's a little bit too ethereal looking, at least for my tastes. And so instead, trying to find that just right speed with a nod to Goldilocks and the Three Bears. But keep in mind also, there's more than one right answer. So this was the interpretation of that alpine stream that I liked best. Others might prefer this earlier version, the previous version that had a much longer exposure. Part of that's just a matter of personal preference. And what that really translates into is that you need to figure out your personal preference so that you're being thoughtful and mindful about the settings. So being aware of what might be happening with the scene. So don't forget, it's a fast-moving airplane, so we want to have a shutter speed that's very fast to freeze the plane, except we don't want to freeze the propeller. So if it's a jet plane at an air show, then yes, by all means, use the fastest shutter speed available. If it's a propeller plane, then we want to generally make sure that we've got a little bit of blur in that prop. So as we're moving along here, a couple of questions. Kathleen says that it seems that the exposure on her cameras are 1/3 to 1/2 underexposed unless I compensate. Could this be due to my eyeglasses allowing light to enter the viewfinder? Not really. So the light coming into the viewfinder would be an issue for, sort of nighttime long exposures where you might have a light behind you and that's bleeding in. The metering really is the issue. If they're coming out, most of those photos underexposed, that means that the camera is perceiving things essentially as brighter than they need to be. It could be that the meter is not calibrated quite right. Different camera makes, actually, you'll find different metering for the exact same situation. They're often calibrated differently. So it's not that it's necessarily wrong per se, just different. And so part of that is learning to compensate. So in my case, I actually, more often than not, need about a -1/2 stop exposure compensation to ensure a good exposure with no clipped highlights. It sounds like Kathleen has the opposite, where she needs to add 1/3 to 1/2 stop of positive or plus exposure compensation. And so it depends on your camera. And again, part of this, as I mentioned before, is getting to know how your camera deals with things. But you might also look at a different metering mode. So for example, play around with spot metering and see if that helps you to get more accurate exposures. The challenge, once again, with spot metering is that now you need to make sure you're metering off the right part of the scene to get a good adjustment. So cameras have to have time adjusted when changing time zones. Smartphones do not. Good question, Richard. So why can't cameras use the same technology that enables this? Certain cameras actually can. So with your phone, they're actually using the cellular network to figure out what the time zone is. And so that only works if you have cellular active. In other words, if you have a cellular antenna. If you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean, then you don't have access to a cell tower and you won't have accurate time on your smartphone. So that's using cell phone technology. Many cameras actually can set the clock based on GPS. So if you have a camera with built-in GPS, that may be an option for you in terms of letting the camera set that automatically. I'm a little paranoid, especially because the camera won't always have a strong GPS signal, depending, especially if you're indoors, for example. And so I prefer to set that manually. Of course, then I run into the problem of sometimes forgetting to set that clock correctly when I change time zones. All right, moving on. Noise, of course, most of us want to minimize noise in our initial capture. And as we're all very much aware, I'm sure, a big part of that is to use the lowest ISO setting possible, generally speaking. There is some variability here, with some cameras actually performing a little bit better in terms of signal-to-noise ratio at a little bit of an elevated ISO. But as a general rule, the lowest ISO setting available is going to give you the best it captures in terms of noise. In other words, minimal noise. But I think perhaps even more important is to not underexpose. And so if you have a scene like this very dark scene, this is in Antelope Canyon near Page, Arizona, and there's very little light in these slot canyons. Well, if I'm going to want to open up lots of shadow detail, the shadow is where the noise is hiding. And so when it comes to noise, if you're going to brighten up the shadows, you're going to reveal the noise, and there's going to be more noise there in the first place. And so try to make sure that you're getting a good exposure right from the start, which leads us to minimizing noise by not underexposing and also setting your ISO as low as you can, depending on the circumstances. But then how do we achieve an optimal exposure? Well, as a rule, an optimal exposure, if you consider that the information we're gathering in photography, of course, is light. Light equals information, and darkness essentially equals a lack of information. We want as much information as possible. Now, with digital, it's a bit different than it was with film. It's sort of more important with digital photography to make sure we're capturing as much light as possible, even if we don't need it. Now, as much light without clipping highlight details. So here I would want the bright areas of the cloud, for example, to be as close to white as possible without actually losing any texture or detail. That's going to give me maximum information, and that in turn translates to minimal noise. And so this is what's referred to as expose to the right, which refers to the histogram. We want that histogram shifted as far to the right as possible without actually clipping highlight detail. Yes, it means that you might have to make adjustments, darken down the photo in post, but that's better than brightening a photo in post where you're going to reveal more noise. Which of course means we need to make use of the histogram and the blinkies, as they're referred to. So the highlight warning, if the highlights are clipped, you can enable a display that those bright highlight areas will be flashing on the screen when you review the image on the LCD. And of course, looking at the histogram, preferably, as you see with this histogram here, full color. So we're seeing all three of the individual color channels, so I can tell if just one of the three channels is clipping. And so this photo, for example, I have what you could say is a good exposure or an adequate exposure, because I have not lost any highlight detail, I have not lost any shadow detail, and I have a pretty good distribution of tonal values. But I could have gone at least a half stop brighter. You can see here, in this case, the exposure compensation was set to minus half stop. It could have been set to even exposure in this case, possibly even a third or a half stop brighter, so that we get that histogram shifted over toward the right so that we're minimizing noise. So as bright as possible without clipping highlights and using both those blinky displays as well as the histogram, and again, preferably the full color histogram, so that if it's red rose in full sunlight, you might have only the red channel clipping, but that is a concern because it means you're going to be losing detail in that red light. In other words, losing texture and detail in your key subject, that red rose. Now, of course, finding the right exposure can be challenging. Ideally, we don't want to be constantly reviewing our histograms instead of capturing photos of whatever's changing in front of our lens. And so that brings us to the notion of exposure bracketing. And there's two key reasons why you might use exposure bracketing. One, of course, as was the case for this set of exposures, is to create a high dynamic range image. So if we look through this range of images, the best exposure for the basilica is probably the second one from the left. Maybe one more to the right of that, but somewhere in that range. But when it comes to the foliage that's more in the foreground, I'm getting a better result with, perhaps the second or third image from the right. And so I couldn't get a photo that retains all of the detail I want in this image with a single exposure. And so in this case, I would bracket the exposures. Here, 7 exposures bracketed by 1 stop, which is really overkill. I could have just used 2 stops and brought that down to maybe 5 exposures at the most. But I had my camera set to 7 exposures for bracketing, and it was easier to just leave it at 1 stop rather than adjust the number of captures. And so here I have more exposures that I need. They're spaced closer together in terms of exposure than they need to be, but it still enables me to capture the sequence and then assemble into an HDR as my final result. The second reason to use bracketing, of course, is peace of mind. If you're not confident that you can get the right shot, and you're in a circumstance where you can't just review the photo, adjust your settings, and capture it again because things are changing, then you might want to use exposure bracketing, perhaps just 3 exposures, for example, 1 stop under and 1 stop over, or more if it's a particularly challenging set of circumstances in terms of the light, high contrast scene, for example. But with that bracketing, so here, for example, bracketing for the purpose of HDR, I'm then able to get a photo that would have been impossible in terms of the level of detail without that bracketing. So I tend to tell photographers you should not be bracketing always, because you shouldn't need to bracket always, because you should know how to get the right exposure ideally. But if you're not confident at that, if you're not feeling good about it, or if it's a particularly challenging situation or a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, that bracketing can certainly make essentially an impossible photo possible in terms of when you might have otherwise missed out on the right exposure altogether. And then also you have that possibility for very high contrast scenes of creating an HDR image to maximize detail. Now, of course, in some cases, photographers are not going to be using only the available light. And in fact, I hear this a lot, and I'm always a little suspicious when I hear photographers say that they are only natural light photographers, that they only photograph with natural light, they don't use flash. The way I usually interpret that is that they're saying that they're not comfortable with flash photography, they don't know how to get a good exposure with flash. And I certainly understand that. It can be tricky to get a sense of how to compensate. We have obviously enhanced metering through the lens metering for flash, so we can generally get very good exposures with the camera doing most of the work. But one of the most important things, I think, when it comes to using a flash, whether it's a built-in flash or a separate flash, is to use essentially exposure compensation for the flash. Almost never do I want that flash at full strength. Most of the time, I want essentially a fill flash. And so I want to end up with just a little bit of additional light, just filling in the shadows, getting a catch light, in this case, in the lemur's eyes. But really, it's more about adding a little bit of light and not overpowering the scene with that light. We want it to still look somewhat natural in terms of the overall illumination. So in this situation, wanting to add flash just to improve the overall exposure, fill in the dark shadows. There was backlighting here to some extent, obviously. And so adjusting. And so that can take a little bit of practice as well. Flash photography certainly can be a little bit challenging in terms of getting the right exposure and the right settings, compensating for the level of light that's already there, the ambient light, versus the flash that you want to add to the scene. But if you're going to do flash photography, or if you find that you're likely to need to use flash in certain circumstances, then I would say that it's time to practice with flash. And always, especially anytime you're going to use a new piece of gear on a trip or a photo outing, make sure that you've taken time to practice using that so that you know what you're in for and can manage it accordingly. All right, so Steve asks, is the histogram in the camera based on a JPEG even if you're shooting RAW? Well, that's sort of a trick question. But yes, in a manner of speaking, the histogram that you're seeing on the back of the camera is based on the JPEG, but that JPEG is based on the RAW. In other words, your camera sort of has a RAW converter built into it. So you're using maybe Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop or whatever software you're using to process your RAW captures into actual pixels. In the camera, that information is being processed. So it's essentially rendering a JPEG preview based on the RAW capture, again, based on the camera's firmware within the camera itself. And so yes, it is essentially based on a JPEG. So it's not 100% accurate. If you have just a tiny little bit of clipping showing on the camera, you can generally get that taken care of with a little bit of post-processing. A good question, sort of a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about so far today, but Jeff asked about cleaning camera lens glass, so liquid cleaner versus microfiber cloth. It's a really good one, a good question in terms of being careful, because microfiber cloths can be great for getting smudges off the lens elements. They also can do a very good job of scratching the lens if you've got like a little bit of sand or other debris on the lens. So using a dust blower or a camel brush, something very delicate to get any debris off the lens, and usually microfiber cloth unless it's really stubborn, and then I'll use special wipes. There's fluid that you can use with a cloth, or they've got actually essentially cloths that already have the fluid built in. And so I find that those work great if you've got kind of, smudgy fingerprints, a kid with greasy fingers after eating French fries touches your lens, and you might want to use some solution to get that off. All right, so then autofocus. And I'll talk about manual focus shortly, but autofocus is, to me, just amazing. I don't even know how I stuck with photography when I got started, especially in high school, where everything was manual focus, and I just can't imagine now being without autofocus. So autofocus today does a phenomenal job, but also it's phenomenally complicated. And so many of the newer cameras, if you take a look at the autofocus configuration, there are a tremendous number of options. So first is continuous versus one shot. In other words, when I am acquiring autofocus, will the camera constantly be trying to find the focus? And so if I'm composing, focusing, and then recomposing, I might not want the focus to change. And then we also need to consider how many focus points we want. So we can have dozens of focus points, and then the camera can choose which one to use, which it's an oversimplification, but think of it as choosing the subject that is closest to you. Whatever's closest to the camera gets selected for focus. The point being is that the camera doesn't always choose the right place to focus on. Sometimes you need that. If it's a bird in flight, you might have a hard time getting good focus if you're not letting the camera do most of the work for you. And then you also have tracking settings within the camera that determine, with a moving subject, as you're panning to follow a flying bird, for example, how does it deal with that? And here there are a huge number of potential variables in terms of, for example, as you're panning across something that's moving across the scene, and then as you're panning, there's, a light post that's closer to you. Does the camera ignore that or change focus to the closer subject? So there's settings in many cameras that'll help you compensate for these types of scenarios. So you really need to dig into the settings that are available so that you can make sure you're taking advantage of those and optimizing them for any given photographic situation. But I also find it can be very helpful in many cases to choose a single focus point. To, in many cases, reduce the number of available focus points, but then configure the camera so that you are choosing a single focus point. So here with the plane flying from left to right, for example, I might select a focus point that is left of center because that's where I want to establish focus based on where I'm going to position the airplane, in this case, in the frame. And so using that single focus point, as the plane flies from left to right, I'm using a focusing point over on the left side. When he makes his turn and comes back to spray from right to left, I'm going to switch that focus point over to the other side. And so using that enables me to pick and choose where I want to set my focus. It also means that I have a target that I can use for properly positioning my subject in the frame. And so once I figure out where, in this case, the airplane is flying and how I want to position him in the frame, I can put a focusing point, select a focusing point that is in the correct position based on where I want that subject. It makes it so much easier to actually track the subject. All right, looks like we've got a couple of other questions here. Oh, Janet, I'm about to get to your question, so that'll be our very next topic here momentarily. And then Tom asks about picture controls. And so the profiles that are in the camera, the various options that are in the camera, those are essentially ignored unless you're using the software from your camera manufacturer. There are some new options, like in Lightroom we have these profiles that we can apply, but those are not affecting the actual raw capture. They're just giving you a different preview. So if you find it helpful, and I'll talk about the color space here momentarily as well, then by all means, I would say that if it makes your preview better, if it makes you happier when you're reviewing the images, then by all means, it's a great idea to set those settings. I mean, it's not going to affect the raw capture, but if it makes your life better, then that's a good thing. And then Jeff asks about putting the camera away for a few weeks. What do you do with the battery? Leave it in, take it out? Well, first off, of course, I'm going to make sure to charge my batteries to make sure that they're all filled up. But the other thing, what I do is actually pop open the battery door, which disconnects the power, essentially pop out the battery so that the battery's still there, and it's obvious to me that I need to push the battery in and close the door. And the reason being is, as I mentioned, my camera has GPS, which I'll refer to in a moment again as well. And that GPS antenna, I leave it active so I don't forget to turn it off, but it also means it'll drain the battery when I'm not using it. So I like to recharge all the batteries, put one in the camera, but have it popped out so that it's not actually being consumed. And to Janet's question, back button focus, yes, absolutely. I am a huge fan of back button focus. This allows you to separate your focus, your autofocus, from the exposure settings. So typically, most cameras, when you press the shutter release button halfway, it's establishing focus and it's establishing exposure. And then when you rotate the camera, if you're on a continuous autofocus mode, it's going to shift its exposure. So the foreground subject, it'll then focus off in the background. And so that gets to be challenging because then, maybe you push the button halfway to set your focus, you recompose, you push the button again, and now you've adjusted focus to focus somewhere else. With back button focus, we can separate these two features. So we can configure a button. Many cameras now have a specific autofocus button on the back for this purpose. Others have sort of a special function button that they can use. So check to see if your camera has it. Most newer cameras do have this option. And then be sure to disable autofocus for the shutter release button. So now you've got one button for your focus and another button for measuring exposure and taking the picture. But practice, because it takes a little while to develop this sort of muscle memory where you're automatically establishing autofocus. For me, I don't even realize I'm doing it anymore. I've been using back button focus for, oh my goodness, probably about 20 years now, 15 or 20 years, and it's just automatic. But initially, you're going to forget to focus because you're going to forget to push that button on the back of the camera. So be sure to practice to the point of that becoming just natural. And then as amazing as autofocus is, sometimes you need to manually focus. Now, I mentioned I would much rather let the camera do the work for me, but I'm sure many of you have found that there are situations where the camera is struggling to establish focus, especially under low lighting conditions. If you're using a lens that has a relatively large, relatively small aperture, in other words, if it's let's say an f5.6 lens rather than an f2.8 lens, then you're going to have less light coming in and the camera will struggle a little bit more to establish focus. So especially as we transition into evening, I find that I'm going to have more situations where it either takes too long to focus or the camera misses the focus. And so in those situations, I will absolutely manual focus. So for night photography, I'm always using manual focus, but I'm still letting the camera help me a bit because I'm using that live view display and using the zoom setting. I'm not adjusting the zoom for the lens. If I'm using a zoom lens, I'm zooming in with that LCD display and then establishing manual focus based on that nice zoomed in view with an exposure preview so that I get a pretty good sense of exactly what that photo is going to look like within certain limitations as far as the light that's available. But point being is that I'm able to establish that manual focus very, very easily thanks to live view. Through the viewfinder, I would struggle, I'm sure, to establish that manual focus well. But with the help of live view and zooming in, it can be just absolutely amazing. Oh, good question, follow-up from Howard. Coming back just a moment to back button focus. When you've established back button focus, do you set up servo mode or continuous autofocus as compared to one shot? And I also say I always have my camera set to continuous autofocus. Always. And then I use back button focus when I want to focus, which means I get the benefit of being able to choose continuous mode or one-shot mode at any time. If I want continuous, a bird in flight, for example, then I can press and hold that back button focus button while I'm tracking the bird. And it will continually update as the distance to the bird, as the bird gets closer or farther away, as that distance changes. And then, when I need to focus and recompose on a subject that's fixed, that's at a fixed distance, then I can actually press the back button focus button until I have acquired focus, then release that button, and I've just gotten the equivalent of one-shot exposure. And so, bearing in mind that we have that ability, you essentially can switch back and forth as needed. All right, so moving right along, and I'll address some of these additional questions that are coming in a little bit later here as well. But next up is mirror lockup, and this certainly, it's kind of a bit of a, I would say, techie feature. Maybe that's not quite the right word. It's a nitpicky feature. A lot of photographers maybe know it exists, but kind of ignore it. Mirror lockup, which I guess obviously means that we're using a digital SLR rather than a mirrorless camera. So those of you that have already gone to mirrorless can ignore this one. Your mirror is always locked up by virtue of not even being there in the camera. But mirror lockup for SLRs is particularly an issue at right about a 15th of a second. So if it's a longer exposure, the vibration of the mirror is such a short portion of the exposure that it's not going to have a significant impact on sharpness. And for faster exposures, that mirror is not going to vibrate enough that it's going to impact the sharpness of the exposure. But it's right around that 1/15th of a second is the key area. So when you're down around those shutter speeds, then I would suggest enabling that mirror lockup if you're using an SLR and if you have that feature available, which these days most SLRs do indeed. Another consideration is making sure that you're not imparting movement to the camera, and so using a cable release or what I refer to as the built-in cable release, the timer mode. So I can set a 2-second timer, for example, so that when I push the button to take the picture, I'm not actually taking the picture, I'm starting the timer, and 2 seconds later, the photo will be captured. So I can push the button, back off, make sure that any of the vibration, any movement I've imparted to the camera has had a chance to settle down. And that also, using either approach, makes it so that you don't really need to be looking through the viewfinder. You can kind of just sit back, watch the scene before you, and as things develop, you can push the button as needed to take a photo. That'll help, of course, minimize vibration, minimize movement. And another area that we want to think about when it comes to movement is stabilization. This goes under all sorts of different names depending on the lens or camera manufacturer. In many cases, the technology is built into the lens. In some cases, it's built into the camera. It's especially helpful for handheld photography because we're now compensating for the movement of the camera. Obviously, we need to recognize the limitations of stabilization as well. So the way stabilization is often marketed is that it's giving you an extra 2 stops or 4 stops so that you're getting the equivalent of a faster shutter speed. But keep in mind, if the subject is moving quickly, then you're not really necessarily getting that full benefit. So we need to take that into account. We can't use, a 1-second exposure just because we have image stabilization if we're shooting handheld. So we need to think about, more realistic limits. And then understand those modes. And there are a variety of different modes for the stabilization features on different cameras and lenses. And most of that relates to using a tripod. So if you're on a tripod, as a general rule, it's usually safest to just turn off stabilization. but in many cases the stabilization is now smart enough to deal with that and to not essentially compensate for movement that's not there. And also there's generally a mode for panning, so that if we're panning across the scene, we're only compensating for movement in one axis versus the other. So there are some technicalities there. I certainly encourage you to read up on the specific features of your camera or lens, as the case may be. But I do encourage the use of stabilization in general because it really can help improve your percentage of nice, sharp images. And then another feature that I love that's available in an increasing number of cameras is a digital level. And so I like to tell all of my workshop attendees or anybody who looks at my photos that if you see a crooked horizon like this, it was most likely captured on purpose so I could teach you the importance of having a straight horizon. Sometimes, of course, you're panning with the subject and you just kind of lose sight of the horizon, getting so busy keeping him in the frame that we forget about the horizon off in the distance. But many cameras now have a level, and so you'll see here, for example, a digital level on the back of the camera, kind of like an artificial horizon in an airplane, and it'll give me, in this case, a green line indication when I have the horizon leveled, when the camera is level relative to the horizon. In many cases, though, you also have this type of display, or it's a variation on a theme, essentially, a display in the viewfinder, which obviously can be even more helpful because now we're able to focus on our subject through the viewfinder and see that digital level in some form so that we can compensate accordingly and essentially make sure that we're keeping our camera as level as possible. And then white balance, a couple settings that are mostly a non-issue for raw capture. So the white balance in the camera does not affect your raw capture other than just changing the default color interpretation when you're processing the image on the computer later. Obviously, it affects the preview on the back of the camera as well. Because of that, I generally just leave my white balance set to the auto mode. That said, in some cases, you might want to make sure that you're starting off with a more neutral color right from the start, or that you're compensating for some particular situation. Mostly there'll be a workflow consideration. So making sure, for example, that all of those photos have the same baseline color interpretation, and I could adjust all of them in post as needed. But just keep in mind that using anything other than the auto white balance for raw capture is purely helping your workflow later, if at all. It's not affecting the actual raw capture. Another setting that is also not affecting the raw capture is the color space. So you can choose in most cameras between sRGB and Adobe RGB. And I would say that first off, it doesn't make any difference in terms of raw capture, but sRGB is usually going to give you a little bit more pleasing preview. The color will usually be a little bit more snappy. It'll vary a little bit, but essentially a non-issue. Mimi asks about coming back to stabilization. If you're using a monopod, what about using that stabilization? And again, yes, provided the lens has a stabilization feature that takes into account essentially the tripod. So you're still going to be panning in one axis, essentially. Ron's got a good question about the night sky image, the Milky Way shot that I showed a few moments ago. What about minimizing noise there? That's a particular challenge because, number one, we're needing to use a long exposure, and with long exposures, there's going to be more noise building up, and the camera's going to heat up, and that in turn will contribute more noise as well. So with night photography, especially out in the real, truly dark areas where literally it is pitch black, and you've got just the light of the stars and maybe the moon to show your way, in those situations, noise is going to become a serious issue, and so it's mostly just a matter of trying to minimize as best you can. You typically have to raise the ISO if you're trying to avoid star trails, for example, so some particular challenges when it comes to that. And yes, by and large, it just means you accept noise, or you buy a more expensive camera that doesn't generate as much noise, but just do a lot of post-processing to try to mitigate that noise. I mentioned earlier, my camera has a GPS receiver built in. For me, I think this is tremendously helpful. Now, I'm biased, obviously, by virtue of the fact that most of my photography involves traveling, and so I'm off in all sorts of different places, and I'm going to forget where I was, and I'm going to forget where a particular photo was captured. And so this is helpful both in terms of me being able to find photos based on location. Oh, where's that photo that I captured, in such and such a location? Or wait, where did I take this picture? And I can go look at the map and see exactly where it was captured. Do note that using that GPS, as I mentioned, it's going to increase battery drain, and even when the camera is turned off, in many cases the camera will continue to acquire that GPS signal, which is helpful for the next time you're out shooting because now it's less likely to need to take a long time to figure out your location. But at the same time, it means you're going to drain the battery potentially even when it is in storage, not being used. So I find that in my case, using GPS full time with my photography, it cuts my battery life, not quite, but about in half. And so it certainly is having an impact, but battery technology has also improved to the point where I'm not finding that is a significant concern for my photography. So I find that the benefits of that information are just tremendous. In fact, I made my choice about which camera to upgrade to based on which one had GPS. That was one of the number one features on my list for me personally. So it's one of those things where it's just really nice to have that information. I don't always need it, but when I would like it, it sure is great to have that in the metadata for my photos. I also like using, many cameras now have an in-camera star rating option. I know we're not supposed to be chimping, we're not supposed to be reviewing our photos while we're out there, but every now and then I want to, well, number one, make sure I've got the right exposure or whatever the case might be, but also I might take a photo and be like, wow, that was really great. I want to make sure to call this one out when in post-processing to make sure that it gets attention in my workflow later. And so I think it's just a really good way of identifying some favorites. I don't use this all the time. I don't use this on every photo shoot. I don't mark all of my future, star-rated images in the camera. Most of that work gets done in post-processing, my workflow after the capture. But every now and then I do find that it's helpful to mark a photo to make sure that I notice it, essentially, a little later in my workflow. Another thing that I learned a long time ago from one of my early mentors in photography, George Lepp, was to set up your camera for your next shot. When you go to put your camera away, one of the key things, this was a very long time ago, mind you, and so the first piece of advice was every time you put your camera away, put in a fresh roll of film so that you're starting with a full roll the next time you head out with your camera, so that if you've got something especially good, you've got a fair number of exposures available. That's obviously changed with digital so that now we're able to capture thousands of photos on a single card, but still configuring your photo for the next shot. So here, standing here, seeing this plane flying at you at 100 miles an hour, that's not the time to consider what should my shutter speed be for this photo. But rather, as we're on our way, this is during one of my photo workshops in the Palouse when we coordinate with a local crop duster, when we're on our way to photograph him spraying the field, I'm always letting my photographers know exactly what settings I recommend so we can pre-configure, get the right lens for the circumstance, in this case a little bit of a longer lens, set up my shooting mode, my exposure mode, set the appropriate shutter speed, for example, basically making sure that my camera is set up for that shoot. Obviously, you can't always anticipate exactly what your next photo is going to be or what those settings are going to need to be, but there's generally, especially if you've made big changes, you've cranked up the ISO and you're, making all these different adjustments to the camera settings to reset to sort of a baseline, set it to f8, etc. But again, to the extent possible, think about what's that next shot going to be and making sure that your camera is best configured to take advantage of those opportunities so that as that plane gets closer, you can get that good shot rather than missing out because you didn't get things set up in the first place. And speaking of those sort of general camera configurations, many cameras now have what are essentially setup shortcuts. They're presets in the camera with saved settings. So the camera I'm using, for example, gives me C1, C2, and C3 for these custom shooting modes. And so C1 is my when in doubt. That's my reset to f8 and 400 ISO, kind of base level settings so that I've got a good starting point for just about any photo and I can fine tune from there. Mostly it's a way to reset if I've applied, wild changes to some of the camera settings. And then C3 is my HDR bracketing. So that gives me a bracketed set of exposures. And normally I have that separated by 2 stops, but I can very quickly get to that basic setup. And I find that to be tremendously helpful if there are particulars. There's kind of my base normal starting point. So my typical configuration that is most commonly used, and then I do a lot of HDR, so that's a common one. So depending on your particular types of photography, you might find that some of those are helpful. And speaking of sort of customizing your camera settings, many cameras now also include custom menus. And so you can put, well, first off, many cameras have what seem to be countless menu options. Fortunately, a fair number of cameras now give you the option to customize a menu. So here you can see I've got format the card here, exposure compensation, my GPS setup, the date and time, and I can pick and choose which menu options I want on this customized menu so that I can quickly get to the settings that I use the most. And speaking of getting to those settings, we have the blindfold test. And so the real question here is, could you adjust your camera settings with your eyes closed? And so I think it's interesting to consider, if you're out in the dark, so here a photo of the lunar eclipse, and out there in the dark, and it gets pretty dark depending on where you are when there's a lunar eclipse, because that full moon just starts to get very, very dark, or when we're out in photographing that image I showed earlier with the night sky, and being able to then work the camera even when it's pitch black out there. Now, of course, you can carry a flashlight, and of course, you could use in many cases, your camera has an illumination for the LED display, for example, up on top. So there certainly are ways that you can illuminate your camera, but I think it's very helpful. Number one, do you know all of the features that are available on your camera? And number two, do you have the ability to find those settings, or at least the key settings, with your eyes closed, so that when you're out there in the dark, you can still find, where's the button where we can change the ISO, or which knob am I using to adjust the aperture, or whatever the case might be. So making sure that you are familiar with your camera enough that you can actually work that camera in the dark. And even if you're not really often in the dark, it doesn't really mean that we need to be taking pictures with our eyes closed. It's more a matter of having that familiarity so that you're able to get to the settings you need as quickly as possible, so that you're as comfortable as you can be with your camera, as confident as you can be with your camera, so that you're always able to get the shot, so that if it's something that's changing quickly, the light's changing faster, the subject's about to leave, that you can get that shot with the right settings quickly and hopefully somewhat easily. All right, so we do have some questions here that I'll be happy to address, as many of these as we can squeeze in. I guess we're already a little over time, but we'll take a few of these questions. I'll try to follow up with some of these via email or in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter as follow-up questions as well. In the meantime, do note, if you're not already signed up for the GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle, that is the bundle that includes absolutely everything that we publish in the GreyLearning library. You can get $50 off just using coupon code WEBINAR at greylearning.com, or just use this link to go directly to that page, to that bundle, with the discount already automatically applied. So let's take a look at some of the questions here. So good question about using in the camera the noise filter. So you have, for example, long exposure noise reduction, a variety of different options in the camera depending on your particular camera. And I do find that that is helpful, that I'm able to get a better result with high long exposure noise reduction in the camera than without, because using that option, the camera essentially is taking two pictures. It takes your photo, and then it repeats the exact same exposure, but with the shutter closed essentially, so that it can measure the noise on the sensor and use that to subtract the noise from your photo. And that can be tremendously helpful. So that's more of a sort of intelligent setting for noise reduction versus software after the fact. Let's see here. So good point about focus tuning and micro adjusting. And so I do find that longer lenses, telephoto lenses, tend to struggle a little bit more, have a bigger difference between their focus. In other words, if it's back focusing or near focusing, that it's going to have a bigger impact. And then with macro, it can be a huge issue as well. So certainly using something like LensAlign, where you can calibrate. The cameras now many cameras have a micro adjustment for focus, so that you can shift that focus forward or back to help make sure that you are getting proper focus, so that autofocus is being set correctly in the camera. So that can be very, very helpful, and it is something you want to do on a per lens basis. Then Mimi asks if I don't have, so if you're using a camera that does not have GPS built in, then what do you recommend? There's a couple of options depending on what your camera has available. So you might be able to get an accessory GPS device that would plug into your camera. So there's a couple of different options here for various cameras. They typically only support a fairly small number of cameras, but if your camera is one of those that's supported, you can have essentially a GPS antenna typically mounts into the camera's hot shoe so that you can then have the equivalent of built-in GPS. It's just not built in. It plugs in separately. Another great option, though, is to just record a track log. And so I very often would use a smartphone. Before I had a camera with built-in GPS, I would use a smartphone, a GPS tracking app, to record a track log. I use an app for the iPhone called GPS Track, easy enough, and that enables me to record. So as I head out for my photography, I start recording a track log, and when I'm finished, I stop recording that track log. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, I'm using Lightroom Classic CC to manage my photos. I can load that track log into Lightroom in the map module and synchronize that track log with the photos that I captured during that time so that the GPS coordinates from the track log are automatically added to metadata for my photos, and it synchronizes based on the capture time. So the camera time and your smartphone time, so all the more reason to make sure that they are set accurately, but you can then use that track log to synchronize. So that can be tremendously helpful if you don't have built-in GPS. Do bear in mind, as I mentioned, with the camera with built-in GPS, your smartphone, if you're constantly using the GPS, typically you'll be recording every, something like 15 seconds, a position report, essentially, depending on how quickly you're moving. That's going to burn up the battery on your smartphone. So you might want to have an accessory battery, for example, so that you can make sure that you've got enough power to last you through the day if you're recording a track log. All right, well, thank you very much once again. I want to thank all of you who joined me for this live presentation, part of the GreyLearning webinar series, and thanks again to Tamron for sponsoring this series. We do have another webinar coming up very soon, so stay tuned. I'll send an email out to everybody who registered for the webinar with those details. It'll also be mentioned in my Ask Tim Grey email newsletter. But as always, I appreciate you showing up to join me, taking time out of your busy day to join me for this presentation, and I'll look forward to hopefully seeing all of you again for the next presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Thank you very much.